If an academic fraud scandal happens on your campus, once the dust has settled, who's responsible for making sure it never happens again? That's the conversation we're going to have today with a member of the Provost's office from UNC-Chapel Hill. Just to give you some background, when the news broke in 2010 of an academic scandal on the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, it first only involved members of the football team. But few knew that the issue would eventually expand to include more than 3,000 students and student athletes taking 200 paper courses offered by the African and Afro-American Studies Department. Among many other outcomes, UNC-Chapel Hill was put on probation by its Regional Accreditation Association and was under investigation by the NCAA. Eventually, they were restored to full accreditation, and the NCAA decided not to hold the institution in violation of its rules. In the fall of 2013, UNC-Chapel Hill was under new leadership, including a new chancellor, a new provost, and a new athletic director. They needed a clear and comprehensive understanding of the academic life cycle for student athletes in order to move forward. Former Provost James Dean, Director of Athletics Bubba Cunningham, convened a 10-person team of campus leaders to do something that we believe no other university has done before: comprehensively document and assess all academic processes that affect student athletes from the time they are recruited until after they graduate. With the chancellor's direction and support, both Dean and Cunningham led the Student Athlete Academic Initiative Working Group in this effort, acknowledging that Carolina needed to make substantive changes to address these issues, restore trust both on and off campus, and promote academic integrity. Most institutions sweep high-profile athletic scandals under the rug. UNC instead chose to build a culture of continuous improvement where everyone on campus plays a coordinated role in student-athlete success. Today's conversation goes behind the scenes with one of the key leaders in this effort, which still continues today. Dr. Debbie Clark led the working group out of the Provost's office for more than 9 years. Debbie takes us behind the scenes of a leadership puzzle. Does change begin at the top with new leadership, or from the bottom up, led by faculty and other key voices on campus? At UNC, it's been both. They continue to address the issues they face in a way that has drawn interest and praise from university leaders across the country. As Clark says, you're building a new culture. It's really a hard thing to do. We recognize now what went wrong and how it went wrong, she said, and this is what we're going to do to fix it. It's a remarkable transition and story. Debbie, welcome to the podcast. I am so glad you're here, and I'm so glad you're going to share your wealth of information with my listeners. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Karen. It's great to see you.
Great to see you as well. You held such a unique role at UNC-Chapel Hill during a very, some would say, fraught time for the campus. And I'd like you just to give a thumbnail sketch. We have more in the intro and more on the podcast notes for listeners to read, but just a brief sketch of how you got to where you got, and then the role that you played trying to make sure this never happened again at UNC-Chapel Hill.
Right. So I got to UNC-Chapel Hill out of my doctoral program at UPenn and in higher ed administration. And the first role that I had there was running the MBA program at the business school. And then many years later, the same person that hired me into that role, we had maintained some connections, and he reached out, and he was new to his provost position at UNC-Chapel Hill. This was in the middle of 2013. And he reached out and he said, I need someone who has expertise in student services, academic affairs, student affairs, and supporting students. We really need to get our arms around all of these academic processes for student athletes from the time that they're recruited until they're alumni, throughout the life cycle. And really the vision that he had, that he shared with the chancellor at the time and got the green light to establish a working group, was to look at all of these processes and sort of understand where we were because you can't make improvements unless you know sort of where you are. And diving into that really, I think, shone a light on all the complexities of that student athlete life cycle. I think something that we quickly understood was that by looking at all of these processes related to student athletes, from the admissions process to matriculation to enrollment, choosing classes, advising, high impact learning exercises, the things that we were doing were also improving academic processes for all students.
Okay.
And so, it was something that's not just focused, it was very much focused on student athletes, but the outcomes were university and institution wide.
So give us a sense, after all the reports were written, the accreditation issues were resolved, which refresh my memory, I think it was 2017 when the accreditation issues were resolved.
Yeah, I think so. I think we started our work in 2013, and we were working in tandem alongside several different efforts. There was an institutional investigation that culminated in the Weinstein report that you can access, and that really is a copious amount of information related to what was going on at Chapel Hill. Our work was tangential to that, and we quickly found that our work was really critical to the response to the accreditation issues, and we worked very closely with the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment on responding to all of the questions that they had, whether it was, advising to syllabi and documentation of syllabi, and whether or not courses were actually were actually meeting, who was staffing courses, just a really, really deep dive into academic administration at the university. And a lot of these reports were written, some of these reports were written prior to the working group being established, and I think were sort of maybe a clarion call to why the working group was brought together. And it was important for us to really look at all those recommendations and use that as a lens through which we could respond to say, here are your recommendations. Here's how we responded to each of these. And all of those are still up on the website. The university still maintains the website, and we still update those processes and provide updated information on everything. There's 20 of them, and we go through those cyclically and also as needed. So for instance, if there's a more acute need, if we need to look at, what sort of high impact study abroad opportunities are we providing to our student athletes, and we'll go to that process and not sort of go through those sequentially. But yeah, it's a lot of information.
It is.
Yeah. So
I just have to say that, and one of the things I said to you when we first connected was that I am absolutely amazed that the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, to this day has an updated website that continues to try to tackle these issues so that it will never happen again. And I've had conversations since you and I first talked with other people who have gone through scandals on their campuses and how it's completely forgotten. The assumption is that the people who did it left, and therefore the campus is immune from any problems again. And I think that's what's really remarkable to me, is this effort to make sure that there was communication flow happening in all directions. Like you mentioned, syllabuses. Who would think about syllabi as being something that could possibly get derailing an academic experience for an athlete? So I wonder if you could talk about that mentality of, nope, we're not going to forget this. This is something that happened to us. We're going to acknowledge it, and we're going to move forward because of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because we've had institutions reach out to us who've gone through similar experiences and said, we'd like to do something similar to what you're doing, because we all know that we're not immune to something happening again. And if you think that that you are, then I think that's pretty short-sighted, right? And so yeah, I mean, it became clear to us as we sort of learned more about just the depth of what had been going on and the impact to the institution, both reputationally and just in terms of, the morale on the campus. We really felt like we needed to make sure that these practices were institutionalized, and that and we relied on strong leadership in all areas, whether it's leadership of the faculty athletics committee, of course our institutional leadership at both the chancellor and the provost level, the leadership of athletics. You and I were talking about this, having an extremely involved, engaged, knowledgeable source of information in your faculty athletics representative, someone who in that role is a connector. That's a really, really crucial role, I think. And just, making sure that you're steadfast and you're ongoing. It can be a slog.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, but we kept at it. The rubric, though, if you look at the website, it's a lot of information. It's not intended to be read, from start to finish. It's intended to be a reference. So, if I'm an institution, I think, I wonder how, UNC-Chapel Hill manages priority registration.
Yeah.
Then they would, search the website. It's pretty easy to navigate. It's got a drop down of all the different processes, and you can search and you find it and you see, oh, the priority registration advisory committee looks at and decides who is participating in priority registration, and does that include athletes or doesn't it, or in what instances does it include athletes? So so we hope it's a good reference, not only for our institution, but also for other institutions that are facing maybe similar experiences or want to avoid, hopefully they're proactive and they want to avoid that, right? I mean, that's the hope. Yeah,
that's right. Did you have to do much substantive training for faculty and staff who weren't part of the athletics program, but needed to have some awareness of this? Was this something that was a focus at the faculty senate level, or at the welcome back to campus, here's what we're going to work on in training levels? I mean, what kinds of direction did you give that way as a campus?
Yeah, so in terms of compliance, like institutional and NCAA compliance, that's really that's managed at the compliance by the compliance department in close partnership with our academic support program for student athletes. So we have academic counselors who work closely with compliance and work closely with the athletes to make sure that they're not making, for instance, course decisions that might, put them under load or put them, completely inadvertently, render them, out of compliance. So, I mean, that's really, really detailed and granular. And so I don't think there's anyone's expectation that a faculty member would understand that. We do have a really helpful, and I'll share the link with you, Karen. We have a really helpful section on our academic support program for student athletes for faculty. And we have a section about oversight and institutional oversight and how that's managed at the university level, but then also how they as individual faculty members can, support the student athletes in their courses, and also give them helpful information that they can use. Another thing that came out of this work was a strong partnership with the Center for Faculty Excellence, and they have a really robust scholarship of teaching and learning area, specifically inclusive learning and teaching and learning, and how to help faculty make their classrooms and their classroom experiences for students more inclusive. And the faculty athletics representative and then the director of the ASPSA, Michelle Brown, work closely with the CFE to come up with a workshop it's an optional workshop that faculty members can attend to learn about the student athlete experience at Carolina and how they can make their classrooms more inclusive to those students experiences. And
So when
Well,
you're saying, I want to make sure I understand. So the inclusiveness is around an athlete feeling welcome in that environment. And
absolutely.
all of the role conflict that they themselves are experiences between student and athlete tension, but also the travel and the missed classes and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. There's that. But then also, there's intersectionality, right? And
Right.
so, a student athlete is not just a member of the team, in which
Right.
that they belong to. They're not just, maybe the big city or the small town that they're from, that they all come with their own individual experiences. And so there's a great deal of intersectionality for student athletes, as there are for all students. So, I could be a student athlete, but I could be, a woman. I could be a first generation college student. I could come from a rural area, or a large, metropolitan area. Like I'm bringing all of these different aspects. And there's also, they focus on, any sort of topics or issues that student athletes have shared with us through through focus groups. That's another project that the working group did with institutional research, is looking at the student athlete experience. We've done a student athlete experience study for the last few years, and it includes items from the study of the student experience in the research university, and other sort of items that are on our existing surveys, but also focus groups that we conduct with them. And so, for instance, some data that we've gathered is, how do student athletes of color navigate the classroom or navigate academic experiences versus, other groups of students, and how can those data and that information help teachers, faculty make their classrooms more inclusive and make the students' experience better.
Such a massive project. And again, you had a lot of turnover. Some of it as a result of folks being asked to leave or being removed from their leadership positions, and others with just getting, I'm sure, I worked at the University of Minnesota coming out of an academic fraud scandal. I know it impacts an institution's academic swagger, if you will, when those kinds of things happen. I mean, how do you get your institution rally the troops, if you will, and say, okay, we can actually make this a model kind of exercise for the rest of higher education to consider, and maybe use us as an example? How do you change that mindset on campus?
Right. I mean, I think first of all, it has to come from from the top down and from the bottom up, right? And so there's a certain level of trust that the institution has to have in its leadership, and I think we benefited from leaders who really cared about the institution, really, from the very beginning. And those leaders may not still be at UNC-Chapel Hill, but they cared very deeply for the institution. They cared very deeply for the reputational excellence of the institution, and most of all for the student athlete experience, and really felt like, this is meaningful work. This is impactful work. This is really important that we do that. And like I said, I mean, you have to have buy-in from across your stakeholder groups. And I can't emphasize enough how much you've got to work hand in hand with your faculty to help them understand the student athlete experience, help them understand how their role directly impacts that. And again, I've got to give kudos to our amazing faculty athletics representative, Professor Lisa Broom. She did a great job bringing in the chancellor. She reports as the FAR, she reports directly to our chancellor, and that's a piece of that institutional control, of athletics, as does our athletics director. And there is just a strong partnership there between those roles, and a bridge between that FAR role and our faculty athletics committee, which is part of our faculty governance, in the faculty senate at some places. That's our faculty governance at UNC, which has a long and strong history of a robust, involvement in shared governance. And so you've got to have transparency. You've got to have information. And you have to have a willingness to look at things and want to improve them. And I think those are things that we did. And I want to make clear, though, this is something that you emphasized at the beginning. We're nowhere near finished. I mean, this is a process, right? This is ongoing. And I keep speaking in the first person. I'm no longer at Chapel Hill. I've stepped away after being there for almost 22 years. And but I do feel strongly that the work that we established and the work that we did there will continue for those reasons.
And that's one of the reasons, many reasons I was so interested in having this conversation, because it should provide hope and inspiration for campuses, who are either saying, well, let's hope that never happens again, which I've seen, or, let's be really preventative and let's involve our faculty more, versus this tension. And I've observed it in many places throughout my career that exists between the faculty and athletics. And I think it's a mistrust. And somehow athletics can blow it for everybody, and the faculty get mad about that, versus it being a partnership.
Right.
And I think that's the thing that really enlightens me and inspires me about the mentality, like you said, top down and bottom up, that the campus has embraced. And that must have been very special to work in that kind of environment.
Yeah, it was, we have a long history and tradition of athletics at UNC-Chapel Hill. And
Yes.
And not just for the folks who go to school there or who work there, but for the citizens of our state. My grandfather was born in North Carolina, raised in North Carolina. He sent two children, my mother and my uncle, to public institutions in North Carolina, but he didn't go to college. He
Right.
and he was a diehard Tar Heel. Light blue ran through his veins. And so, there's a strong connection of the institution, not only to the folks who are directly, attending or working or affiliated with the institution, but just the strong commitment to the state. And so, that's another reason that we've just, as an institution, we felt like it was critical that we recognized that rich history. We recognized what went wrong and how it went wrong. Issued a mea culpa to say, we got this wrong, and this is what we're going to do to fix it. And so, again, it's got to be ongoing. It has to be deliberate. And to speak to what you were saying, even when leaders leave, and different people who are involved in that leave, it needs to keep going.
Yes.
You don't want to lose all of that hard work and that knowledge and that trust that you build. It would just be a shame, to let that go by the wayside.
You're building a new culture, and that is a really hard thing to do. The old phrase of the Carolina way meant something at one point in the history of the institution, but would you argue that it means something a little bit different today?
When I think of the Carolina way, as someone who worked at UNC-Chapel Hill for 22 years, I think of Dean Smith.
Yeah.
And so, I think for some folks who were observing what was going on, they kind of used that as an analogy for maybe what had gone wrong. But, the Dean Smith way was, play smart, play together, and always acknowledge the person that helped you get there. Right. And so, absolutely. That, I feel like as an individual, I can't speak to, how did Carolina align or misalign with the Carolina way, but I'm sure that folks were probably looking at it and thinking, how in the world did we get here? Right.
Yeah.
And so, the strength of that strong athletic culture that Coach Smith and the folks who've come after him helped establish, all the more reason to really look at this and see it for what it was, and say, what, we can do better. We are better than this, and we can do better than this.
Yeah, you build on the original good intentions.
That's right.
And you move forward. And something, Debbie, before we wrap up, you said to me at the beginning today, before we started recording, which I really want my listeners to hear about, is that you didn't come into this work at UNC and knowing a whole lot about athletics. You
No.
were not in the athletics department, you were in the business school. You basically saw the enterprise as a whole rather than separate pieces. Give us a little bit of a sense of why this kind of work can be done by a lot of different people, not just somebody in athletics or who's a fan.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think that's why maybe the provost brought me in, because to use a sports metaphor, I didn't have skin in the game. And I learned that after I started doing this work, because I don't know a lot of sports metaphors. I think I'm proof of concept that someone who wasn't sort of professionally and otherwise sort of brought up in a super athletic culture can really put your arms around how college athletics works, and identify the pain points. And I also, I hope that the role that I played also was a bridge, kind of like, I mentioned like Dr. Michelle Brown and the academic support program for student athletes, and Professor Lisa Broom, sort of a bridge between the student athlete experience and the academic experience, understanding that these are students, these are young people who are coming to our institution, and we have a commitment to them to provide the best educational and student experience possible. So that was sort of my passion that I brought. But if you had told me prior to this how much I would have learned about how athletics, works at a college, I wouldn't have believed you. I just had a really lovely farewell celebration at UNC with my friends and colleagues, and Lisa Broom spoke, and she said, I know Debbie doesn't look like she knows a lot about athletics, but she does. And I thought, well, what about me? What about me doesn't look athletic, Lisa? I was standing next to actually a colleague from athletics, and he and I just, we're chuckling about it. But I do think that I think we all are, all of us that were involved in that exercise, and who the folks there who are still involved in that, from institutional research to athletics to the provost office to, all the colleges and academic units. It was a way for us to educate ourselves and to understand better what was going on, so that we could make it better, and so that it will continue to get better.
Yeah, I think that's a remarkable thing. Debbie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, for reaching out and saying, hey, I think we have some things in common, and for most importantly, wanting to share your experiences and knowledge with our listeners. I'm really grateful.
Well, I'm grateful to be with you. Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.